First of all, I'm very happy to be here and to be part of the Transmat project. This is my second visit to this museum. The first was, I think, our first meeting in FIGUEIRA, right? And then we came here, and it's nice to see things that have been done. I'm not really a fan of the word progress, but I think at least there's been creativity, right, and effort, and we're going to see the fruits of that, I think, this afternoon in terms of curating. I want to thank especially Elizabeth, who's not here right now, because she's working on that, and the rest of the Transmat team, and everyone here today, and particularly those who have spoken so far today, from whom I've learned a lot. And I want to begin piggybacking on the opening keynote, I think it was by Miriam, when she pointed out that it's important to recognize mistakes. And I think the biggest mistake in this work is to assume that what we are doing is new or better than what has been done in the past in museums. And so, in the spirit of listening, I want to beg you all to listen to museums of the past. Don't dismiss them as being colonial or as being less than you are, but try to understand them on their own terms. Why did they collect what they collected? Why did they curate the way they did? And I think that's the place to start, really, in this conversation. And I make that point as part of a larger one about the nature of museums. I think everything that's been said today is true, but it's also true of all museums, not only colonial museums. All museums are colonial, and all collections are colonial. Almost every painting in a Western metropolitan art museum are colonized objects taken from churches, missions, convents, and so on, robbed of their spiritual content and put on display as art. This includes really almost every major icon of Western art. Almost all of Roman art is colonized Greek art, and so on. You can go down the line, right? That is, what we're talking about is built into the very nature of collecting and display, and has been since the beginning of museums. Okay, I have a long paper which I'm not going to read, because this is not just an academic conference. This is about putting our ideas into practice, I think, particularly in museography. And so what I'll do instead is walk you through some exhibits that I've studied and visited over the last 2 or 3 decades, and which are in the book, The Museum of Babel, which was just published. So the first general conclusion, and I'm not going to give the evidence for it because it will take too long, but you can read the book or we can talk about it later, is that when you look at the history of museums, museums are about ruin and forgetting, not primarily about memory or about preservation. They lose most of what they collect, and they forget what it originally meant. And this is true of really all major museums. The Louvre, the British Museum, the Prado, we could go down the list. What I've concluded is that actually they fail to represent anything other than their own histories. What this means is that the true vocation of the museum is to be a museum of itself, a museum of a museum, or in short, a metamuseum. And this has become increasingly clear because of the so-called return to curiosity, or what I call the metahistorical turn in museography. That is, all major museums around the world now exhibit evocations of their own past, often as ancestral cabinets of curiosity, in other cases as access to their storage, and to their methods, right? The so-called laboratory museum, which is a very old concept. And as a result, curating is more about curating the museum, that is, caring for the museum, which means caring for the museum's past. In other words, museums don't represent the world. They represent themselves. And so the question is really today for our conference, not how do you decolonize the museum, but how do you decolonize the Metamuseum, since that's what the museum is. Decolonizing the museum is actually an old project. In terms of sort of literally, that is, in terms of using the term in ways that are consonant with the way we use it, you can trace this, and also the notion of repatriation, to the 1810s and 1820s. The first sort of official treaty of repatriation is the Treaty of Paris of 1814, in which Napoleonic France is forced to return stolen objects to Italy and Spain. Most of the objects are not returned. Most of them end up in private collections, but a significant number are returned, and those become the basis of national museums in Spain and Italy. Similar things happen in Latin America in the 1820s, when Latin American nations become independent, and when they do, what they do is they expropriate colonial collections in their countries. So, for example, most of the national museums of Latin America are based on Jesuit collections. This is the case in Brazil, for example, very clear, but also in most of the other countries, or crown collections, which were already in their countries. And this is because, this was possible because, and this is my other point, those collections were based on collaboration and networking. We heard this point over and over again today, but I want to stress the fact that all museums and all collections are based on networking and collaboration. Always have been. There's no other way to do it. In the world that I research, which is the Hispanic world, it's very clear that the first royal collections at El Escorial are the result of collaborations between native informants and crown officials and missionaries, right? And they produce ample documentation, and we're able to trace many of the objects as a result. So that is also not new. We could talk about modes of collaboration, perhaps, and networking, but not networking and collaboration as being new. They're as old as museums. Okay, so again, without providing the evidence, I want to argue that the task today is not to decolonize the museum anymore. The task is to metacolonize the museum. And what I mean by that is to turn the museum inside out and to step through its mirror of the world, step through its narrative. And I think museums are actually quite capable of doing this, and I give a number of examples of how this is done, how it's been done in a number of museums around the Atlantic world in the book. We can talk about what that term means exactly, metacolonize, but I think it's better to go to examples. Now I want to talk about briefly the sort of the museum at large. And I want to suggest that Las Meninas, which is an iconic painting that most of you recognize. It's the Prado's crown jewel. It's the Da Vinci, I would say. It's the Mona Lisa of the museum world. It's much better than the Mona Lisa in many ways as a representation of representation, right? Which is what Michel Foucault called it in The Order of Things. Foucault missed something important in his reading. If you can remember, he reads the Las Meninas as the frontispiece, right? To las palabras y las cosas, right? Words and things. As a representation of representation. But what he doesn't note is that representation of representation was made possible by the Prado Museum. Because prior to that, it was a private painting, right? In the chambers of the king. It was not possible to observe. That is a result of the Prado. The effect is what I call the mirror of the mirror. That is, in the painting, the sovereign gaze is outside the painting, right? And it's mirrored. The mirror in the back of the painting shows the sovereigns who are watching the painting, right? For whom it's being painted by Diego Velázquez. I argue that this is the situation of the spectator in the museum. That is, we are a sovereign subject, but we're also captive of the museum. And in this play of sovereignty and subjectivity, the museum performs its magic. Now, what metacolonial curating or metahistorical curating involves is stepping through that mirror. Of course, if you have a mirror and you step through it, what do you have? You look both ways and you see an abyss of repeating mirrors, right? You've done this, right? You hold up two mirrors and you put yourself in between. This is essentially, I think, our predicament in the Metamuseum age. So how do we do this? Okay, what I do in the book is I visit a series of representations of the museum's own past, right? Exhibits of the museum's own past. And this is done almost in every major museum, and I selected some of the big museums and also some of the ones that are not so big, right? I talk about the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Prado in terms of big ones, but then I also go to smaller, lesser-known museums that do similar things. If you look at this one, I think it's particularly stunning. This is at the Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales in Madrid, where the Meninas effect is very, very clear. In fact, the museography is sort of you might say, an echo of Las Meninas. You have in the rear the portrait of Charles III, who is the patron of the Real Gabinete de Historia Natural, created in the second half of the 18th century in Madrid, but which is a collaborative effort with mainly Creole, but not only Creole, also Mestizo and native collectors and agents of the crown in the New World who submit the objects, and then they are collected and curated. The primary collection is made by a Peruvian Creole born in Guayaquil, which is today part of Ecuador. At the time, it was part of the Viceroyalty of Peru. And his collection is purchased by Charles III, and he is brought with his collection to be the new director of the Gabinete in Madrid. And at the time, the collection of, his name is Pedro Franco Dávila, was considered by French connoisseurs to be better than that of the French king, which is, as you know, the basis of the Natural History Museum in Paris. But also the basis of many of the collections of art in the Louvre. Okay, so it's a serious collection, and it comes to Madrid. Okay, this particular exhibit I think is quite striking because in the center is a vitrine which represents Eden. You have here skeletons of Adam and Eve, and they are open-mouthed, naming all the specimens on display, which are from this guy in the bust over here. This is the Peruvian, the collector, with him naming the objects. In other words, it's a metaphor for naming things, as the artist Rosamund Purcell explains. But what it clearly, I think, shows is, and also the experience of visiting it, is that our position of spectators and namers of things is that we too are captives, are specimens in the museum, along with them, along with the specimens as well. Now, the artists and the curators were inspired by the collections of the cabinet that I just mentioned from the 18th century, what's left of it after it was sacked by the French and most of it lost to decay. She was also inspired by this triptych, right, the retablo of Hieronymus Bosch, El Bosco, which now hangs in the Prado, but which in the 16th century was in Philip II's El Escorial, one of his favorite paintings. Prior to that, it was in Ghent, the Ghent of his father, Charles V, in a private collection, and then it came to Felipe II, who was one of the world's leading collectors of art. And that's really the origin of the Prado. Some of the greatest collections. It was plundered and lost, and then it was purchased again by the Prado in the 20th century and reclaimed for the museum for Spain. Let's see. To make a long story short, the origin of the Prado is what I call the original sin of art. The Prado was designed to house the natural history cabinet. It was not designed to be an art museum. This is very well documented. Charles III wanted the greatest natural history museum in the world, which would be better than the French one. And he would have had it. He had it built. He had the collections. It was a question of putting it in the museum. But unexpected events. Charles dies. There's political intrigue after that, and then there's the Napoleonic invasion of Spain and Portugal, right? Which the Portuguese know very well. In Portugal, the crown moves to Brazil, right? The Brazilian Empire is born. Collections go there. It's the origins of the National Museum in Rio. Is the royal collections from Lisbon. In Spain, what happens is what's now the Prado, which was built, but wasn't yet occupied, and there were details to finish. was occupied by the French command, and the grounds around is where all the troops camped out, right? The occupying troops. And so the cabinet never moved in to where it was supposed to be, its home. José I, Joseph Bonaparte, was proclaimed king, and he created a museum of painting, based on art stolen from Spanish monasteries and churches by French troops, okay? And brought to Madrid from places like Seville and Toledo and so on, to a collection. So he created an art museum, not in this building, but in a expropriated monastery in Madrid. When the French were driven out by the resistance, they carried a lot of loot back to Paris, including natural history objects, paintings, and so on. But they couldn't get it all out, and enough remained in this monastery for when Ferdinand VII, the Spanish Bourbon king, returned, he decided to create a museum as well, based on Joseph's museum, and but not quite the same. He returned a lot of the paintings to monasteries, although not all, and decided to keep as a crown property sufficient to open a new museum. And they decided to occupy the building that was supposed to be the Natural History Museum. And that's the origin of the Prado. As I said, the Bosch painting is now hung in the Prado. The Prado is, of course, an art museum. It wasn't intended to be an art museum. But within the Prado itself, we have a number of traces of this original sin. That is, the basis of the Museum of Art is the displacement from its promised land, right, of natural history objects, which were sent into Exodus and would not find their own museum for a long time. And what I'm going to say now is a result of recent curating and historical research. But what's interesting about, I think, particularly the Bosch, is not, and by the way, the retablo is not, it's the biblical story, right? It's a biblical story of Eden, and the center panel, which is the one often that people pay most attention to today, is the state of humanity just prior to the deluge. Okay? That is, licentious and sinful state of humanity, which God is now going to clear, right, with a flood. And then we're going to go on to the next, right? And then, of course, in the third panel, we have hell, right, Inferno, which is where all these people will go, right, if they don't change their ways. That's what the painting is about. But the content is very interesting, right? The content really tells us a lot about contemporary natural historical knowledge and about the history of conquest and colonization, which is the source of the historical knowledge. So, for example, here, and I say the New World here because Bosch's model for paradise is the Canary Islands. What we have is the fauna of the and flora of the Canary Islands, including the people. Those of you who know something about the Bible know that the descriptions of paradise are that people like Adam and Eve are running around naked, right? And that's a sure sign that we're in paradise. And of course, when the Spaniards arrived in the Canaries, they found, lo and behold, people did not wear clothes. And so the Canaries was early on associated with Eden. And things like the drago tree, but you can see here the dragon tree, is the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. Now, all of this is impossible without the Spanish conquest of the Canary Islands. What happens next is, of course, the Spanish conquest and colonization of the New World. And when that happens, Eden moves there. And so subsequent representations of Eden, for example, the most popular is Peru. I'm not going to go into that. We can show plenty of examples of that. In other words, the history of art, if we look at it not in terms of apparently what art says, right, but what it contains, that is its materiality, its objects, it tells a very different story. And this is very useful, I think, for our project and for the project of what I'm calling metacolonizing the museum. And of course, I'm not making this up. I've learned it from visiting recent exhibitions and talking to curators and looking in the archives of museums like the Prado. Anyway, this was in 2014 exhibit called Historias Naturales, occupied the arc that was occupied by art, the Prado. What Miguel Ángel Blanco does in this temporary exhibit is he brings back some of the surviving objects that were supposed to be in the Prado, right? But because of Napoleon, aren't. Okay? Just imagine today the Prado, which you've probably all visited, as being the greatest natural history museum in the world. That's what it was intended to be. But there are traces of this in the Prado, it turns out, in the paintings, because the paintings register sort of knowledge about nature and about people from the period, right? And so this gives us another way to read the history of art, one which the Prado will not tell you, but which is right before our eyes. We just have to retrain our eyes to see it. And Miguel Ángel Blanco helps us do that in his temporary exhibit, which is no longer there, and so it's been forgotten, like most things in museums. It was stunning to see this. It was done, of course, during the off-season, because it would not be tolerable, obviously, to the masses of tourists who arrive in the summer and so on. I think the Prado visitorship is up there. After the Louvre and the British, I think it's right there, right? In terms of number of visitors. I'm now going to shift gears a bit. In the book, I talk about the history of the representation of art history, and natural history museums as being a sort of a pivotal moment, not only in Spain, but throughout Europe and the Americas, in which art wins and nature loses in terms of what will represent man, right, and the nation, and I think in general the museum world, right, we could say as well. Now the canvas and the art gallery and the art museum become the dominant sort of mode of representation, and of course the biggest market and the most important museums. There's a kind of a subsidiary vein, which is sort of sculpture and architecture because of the Greco-Roman heritage, which gets in there as well in art museums, and sort of eventually ends up sort of in archaeology museums or art and archaeology museums, or things like the British Museum, which maintain that heritage as being one of the Western heritage. Okay. But I suppose what marks modernity is the canvas, and it's not natural history objects. Now, natural history objects did have their sort of their zenith, their eureka moment, I think, in the 18th century, and after that it's a decline. And that has to do with the Cabinet of Curiosities, which is something I'm going to end on, and on the real virtue and value of cabinets of curiosities today and for the future. Anyway, I'll get to that. Starting now, actually, and that is more recent exhibitions, let's call them, and they call themselves decolonial cabinets. And I'm going to go fast forward to last year at the Biennale, right, in Venezia. Foreigners everywhere, which is a really interesting Biennale, whose theme was decolonizing contemporary art and shedding, including the global South, right, in the contemporary art world. And so there were a lot of artists and curators there who were there for the first time, right? Okay, I'm going to talk about just two pavilions, the Spanish and the Portuguese, just to stay more within my realm of expertise. There were many others that are very interesting and worth comment, but I won't be doing that. These two, because I know about their histories and where the collections come from, and so on. Okay, in the Spanish pavilion, we had Migrant Art Gallery, Pinacoteca Migrante, right, by Sandra Gamara and curated by Agustin Perez Rubio, who was formerly at Malba in Buenos Aires, but he's Spanish. And what they did is to take iconic, really pieces of art, you could say, from Spanish museums, and use copies of them and then essentially deface them or comment on them as being colonial objects. Okay, so in the first room, when you come in, you have virgin land, Tierra Virgen, and we have a copy of a painting by Frederick Edwin Church, which is not nowhere is it referenced or mentioned that it's by church or that this is the title of the painting, but that information is not given. You have to know it or find out by other means. And what we have is handwritten over it, right? Some words, you can see it there in white handwriting. What the artist is trying to show us here is that the land was not virgin, that this is a colonial trope, that is, the representation of empty landscapes was a colonial trope that denied the agency and presence of indigenous people, indigenous labor, and so on. This is the, and she backs this up with some quotations, one of which is here. Again, coming at it as a historian, it's problematic. It's problematic because, first of all, the sources she cites are not the correct ones. That is, the people who make the arguments are different ones than the ones she cites. The people that she cites are actually citing that earlier literature. So that's a problem. But the other, I think, major problem is that the spectator is not able to understand anything about the specific history of the object. Instead, the object here is a colonial object, right, to be critiqued and written over. And I think as a result, the decolonizing gesture backfires. I want to develop this point a bit here about the dangers of a decolonizing gesture when it comes to objects themselves. That is, if curating is about caring for objects, it doesn't really matter what the object is. If it's a colonial object, a post-colonial object, a pre-colonial object, it should always be, I think, treated with care. And that means information should be made available, not necessarily, all over the place so that you can't appreciate the object, but it should be made available in some form. In most cases, probably be made available in an app or in a screen, which a spectator could then consult. But this sort of thing was not done in this installation. Here's another example in what's the artist calls the cabinet of extinction. In this case, the artist has taken botanical plates from José Celestino Mutis, from José Celestino Mutis' Casa Botánica, which was a workshop in Bogota, which, after it was set up, gained the status of una real expedición, a royal expedition. But I think what the artist doesn't grasp is that this distinction, did not make it a colonial expedition, right? In the way that we think about it, which is mainly based on French or British examples. Because in the Spanish world, in the Hispanic world at this time, what it meant was granting license mainly to already established investigations and workshops, which would allow them to gain access to funding and be able to publish. That was mainly what it meant. In this case, what the artist wants to do is depict with the painting of hands, which he describes as the the unrecognized voices behind the creation of the botanical plates, which he refers to as indigenous labor in plantations and indigenous labor in collecting. But the problem with this is that actually almost all of the drawings were made by indigenous artists and mestizo artists who were working for the workshop. In other words, what the botanical plates represent, and they're deposited in Madrid in the Royal Botanical Garden against the wishes of the workshop of Bogota, which wanted to retain them. Actually, what it represents, if we read against the grain of the artist, is the fact that, yeah, actually, these were made by indigenous hands. But the spectator to this exhibit is denied this knowledge. Another example, this is in the same room. You can see the plates there on the wall, and which is particularly dear to me is the Cuadro del Perú, which I've written about and which has been part of the LA Global Project now for a number of years, researching the making of this cuadro, who was involved, why it was produced in Madrid, and so on, and not in Peru, where actually the drawings on which this is based and all the objects in it were collected and made. What the artist does here, the decolonial intervention, she calls it the cabinet of extinction because many of the things represented are extinct. Some are still there, obviously, in terms of plants, birds, and animals. Many of the groups which are named as naciones, nations, has since changed quite significantly, but many of their descendants are in fact still there, not extinct. And so she takes it as a record of extinction. But in many ways, her own intervention produces an extinction of its own. What the artist has decided to do, hopefully you can see it there closer, this is the actual cuadro, which you can, by the way, you can, is on the Google Arts and Culture platform, thanks to the museum. If you compare it with what the artist did was erase all the text, which is very extensive, and also replace the maps with little shells, right? And in doing so, I argue she has performed an extinction of its own, right? A decolonial extinction. That is, the viewer is robbed of the possibility of being informed by the persons who actually assembled this object. The text is incredibly informative. He not only tells us about what the purpose was not colonial, but it gives us a lot of hints about who was involved. The map is also very important because it allows us to understand some of the provenance of the objects. And we've been able to piece that together by and large over the years, and now we have quite a good understanding of this. This was made, by the way, in 1799. Okay, here's a close-up. You can see the text and the maps which have been erased in the exhibit in the Spanish Pavilion. An alternative is, and this is, I suppose, self-interested, but there are other ways of doing this, is to visit the Quadro on our website, LA Global, at FLACSO in Ecuador, where you have the cabinet. It's kind of fun to go through it. So in the animated, it talks about the different objects in it, where they're from, what they mean, what they meant at the time, why the Quadro was made, and so on. You can do that there. But very briefly, the Quadro was really made to impress the crown of the natural and human diversity of Peru, and to make an argument for its sovereignty within the crown. And you have to understand something about the way the Hispanic Empire functioned. The Hispanic Empire in the late 18th century was becoming more centralized, which is why the gabinete is going to be in the Prado. But historically, the collections were all dispersed all over the empire. And that was fine, because the mode of rule of the Habsburgs, particularly, was to have a polycentric empire with various centers, which is why they created universities and collections all around the empire since the 16th century. And so there wasn't a desire really to centralize. It wasn't sort of in the plan. What the Quadro represents is sort of an attempt to say, you know, we have this all understood, we have it under control in Peru, and you know, we're happy to show you what we have, but you know, we can have it here, right? And this is part of a wider movement in the Peruvian Enlightenment to, while recognizing Peru's place in the empire, to assert its, what today we would call autonomy, right, within the realm, in ways that are similar to the way that regions of Spain operate today, by asserting their autonomy vis-a-vis Madrid. This kind of model was alive and well, still in the 18th century, in places like Peru and Nueva Granada, which later became Colombia, and which explains why it is collections were made there, and why it is that representations of those collections were sent to Peru, to Madrid. Okay? So what we have in short is if you want, a different history of empire, although we can also find similar examples in British and French empire of this sort of thing. I'm going to end on talking about the Portuguese pavilion, and then make a few concluding remarks. The Portuguese installation was very different. First of all, it wasn't in the Giardini, nor was it in the Arsenale, but instead in the Palazzo Loredan, which is on the Grand Canal, but sort of on the other side, on the other end of Venice. A somewhat more independent space, really, you could say. And I think a particular interest was the Creole Garden that was installed there. It's very, what they did is they occupied this palace as in a gesture. They call it decolonial. I would say it's really more metacolonial. That is, it's occupying sort of the master's house, which turns out to be our house, but in a way that makes us think about sort of the sources of its aura. Right. This is the home of the Venice Academy of Arts and Sciences, right? A prestigious, long-standing institution of knowledge, but also one that is is geared towards disseminating knowledge to the general, right, to civic society. That's what Academy is about. So what they did is they made installations in various parts of it, and which allowed you to reflect on that, but also on the Carnation Revolution, the history of decolonization in the Portuguese world, and some sort of notions which came out of that conjuncture, which we've heard mentioned today by folks who witnessed it. The metaphor they used, the material metaphor they used, was a sort of a liberated slave plot planted in the library of the Academy. And then they had performing artists in different rooms of the library, raising relevant themes to those spaces about the importance of slave labor in global empires, the importance of plants in the making of libraries and books, right? So there was both a material and a sort of a historical engagement. It didn't burn the library or what it did is it sort of silently occupied it, and I think a way which was quite striking, and then combined with the performances, allowed visitors to interact and ask questions. It was very different than the exhibit in the Spanish gallery, which is quite a monologue, a lecture really, on how we're supposed to read colonial art. Okay, I was going to use some examples from Mexico City and Madrid, but and Barcelona, I'll skip over those, and Paris, and Coimbra. I'll just leave that up there for now and conclude. And I'm going to conclude on an argument by Jacques Rancière in The Emancipated Spectator. In The Emancipated Spectator, Rancière, he's talking about the theater, but I think it applies equally to the museum spectator. He argues that if our goal is the emancipated spectator, and I think we share that, I think everyone shares that here, how do you get there? Do you get there by lecturing the spectator about what you think you know? Or do you get there by sharing your ignorance? And Rancière argues that the only way there is to share your ignorance, because that allows the spectator to find the third thing that nobody knows, and that the schoolmaster or the curator also does not know. And so that metacolonial curating is about not telling the spectator how to think about the colonial or correcting what colonial curators have done, but instead to make it possible to know the third thing that no one knows. And the question is, how do you do that in curating? And I'm going to leave that question open. I have some ideas, and I give examples in the book, but perhaps we can just leave that question open for the group. Thank you very much.
I thank you very much. I loved it. Beautiful talk. I just want to push you a bit further to this whole idea of the coloniality of all museums and the ever-presence of coloniality in all collections. And my worry is around how, in most cases, natural history museums or museums with natural history collections seem not to want to engage with this decolonial question, because there's this belief that natural history collections were collected from perhaps ethical practices. What do you think about the dichotomy between nature and culture in museums, and how this is reinforced within colonial collecting practices in view of your colonial question of everything is colonial? We must not divide between what then is a natural history collection, what's a cultural history collection.
Hello? Okay. Well, thank you so much for a thought-provoking presentation. I pretty much follow your argument about, well, I think I do, about this whole the postmodern problem or paradox, this idea that the museum in the end is hopelessly self-centered. But we all have also learned a lot of critical methodologies, this idea of going or reading along and against the grain of archives. And I pretty much agree with you on the possibilities of understanding how colonial collections had the interventions or were shaped by local agents, and it's very important. And these critical methodologies allow us to try to find that in the archives and in the museum. So my question is, what makes you think, what is emancipatory for you in the colonial metaphor that makes you keep it in this idea of the metacolonial curating? And I can think of a number of examples where this idea of restaging colonial discourses as a way to kind of question or raise questions or make the spectator raise questions about what they're seeing that have gone really wrong and didn't work. So if I'm understanding your idea correctly, yeah, do you find risks and limitations about this idea of restaging, which is what I think you mean by metacolonial curating? Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Yeah, I mean, what was really striking to me in the research I did is I began, I'm a historian, but I have a past as an archaeologist, and I was struck by how historiography, narratives from history were clearly readable in the displays of museums, right, in the history of displays. So I thought, well, okay, I can read the history of museography. It's pretty much just follows the history of historiography or ethnography and so on, right? You can find those correspondences and natural history as well. In other words, the disciplines that we want to get rid of are very useful, the history of the disciplines, for reading actually the museum. And we shouldn't, discard them, but we should learn from them, I think. Because disciplines are big things, and there's all kinds of debates within them all the time. If you actually dig in, you'll find that at any given moment, whatever the dominant line is of discipline, there are also other contesting perspectives within the discipline, right? So disciplines tend to be actually very messy historically, and historians of science know this, right? And so we need to do it better. We need to do better histories of disciplines, I think, rather than say, oh, the disciplines are bad and we need to go to a transdisciplinary museum. And this goes to the question of nature and culture and natural history versus cultural history. Museums, they of course began as being one, right, historically. So I think what's useful is just go back to those moments. And you can do it in every major collecting society, if you will, right? You can find the moment prior to disciplinary museums are all invented in the 19th century. Before that, cabinets included everything, right? Natural, all the anthropology museums are offspring of natural history museums. Art museums are offsprings of cabinets and so on and so forth, right? So if you go back far enough in time, you can find clues about what it means to be transdisciplinary, because that's an old story, right? That was going on for centuries before museums were disciplined in the 19th century. And so I found it very interesting to look at early modern collections and to see that actually they're not very much like the exhibits of cabinets that pretend to represent those things today. What those exhibits today try to do is they try to provide an autobiography of the museum from the perspective of the museum today. However, if you know something about the objects, you can question that narrative, right? Which is what I do in the book. I say, okay, the Ashmolean presents its past in this fashion, but in fact, this is not true. This object tells us a different story. Okay. But I can do that because the Ashmolean has put it on display. It's no longer in storage. I couldn't do that before. And so it's a good thing, but what it does is it sort of, you know, it's something else. I don't know if that answers your question. I think he's gone to sleep. But that's how I would deal with that. In terms of what does metacolonial mean, I think it's, what I mean at least is, that you don't erase the colonial. That's a very bad thing to do because the history of museums is about erasing the museum's own past. You know, we're talking here about doing something new, and no, museums have always said that what they're doing is new. That's the worst thing that we can do, because museums have always been doing that, and as a result, they have buried their own pasts. Okay? So museums are forgetting machines, and it's very easy to show this. If you go into the archive, they have erased most of their own history of display. And the fragments that survive, however, allow us to construct a very different history of the museum. So, in other words, metacolonial curating maintains the colonial, and it interrogates its history, and it, I think, raises questions about the larger nature of the museum, which I said I think is colonial. That is, for example, in the British Museum now, in the Enlightenment Gallery, there was an intervention by the new director, Fisher, during the pandemic, which was convenient, right? All museums closed, and they used that time to reorganize their exhibits, right? To update them. And of course, that was a moment of Black Lives Matter. And so what was decided, because of debates in the UK, was that now the Enlightenment Gallery would talk about slavery and colonialism, right? Which it didn't do before, at least not explicitly. But the result, in part, is very mixed. In part, it, I think, actually impoverishes the Enlightenment Gallery and what it's able to say, because it sort of pigeonholes it. Whereas, in my view at least, the entire British Museum is colonial. And, but it's a colonial in the sense that we all are, right? That is, we are all a product of that. And so, that is, we need to critique it with care, and we need to do it in a fashion which is emancipating, I think. And I think that's the measure. And so I guess that's my wider recommendation, is that when you're thinking about decolonizing the museum, think about it, is this an emancipating curing of the past? And if not, then there's probably a problem that needs to be rethought. And I'm hoping that that's what we're going to see now. In
Okay.
the next session. Yeah.
Thank you.